In building fires, a real understanding of fire physics is needed, together with knowledge of different building types and structures and their varied tolerance to fire stresses. Firefighters are trained to recognise the signs of partial building failure, especially with older structures, which were not designed to tolerate and contain fire travel. A dramatic and potentially lethal example of fire physics in action is the backdraft, which can occur if fresh air is reintroduced into a fire compartment in certain situations.
Oh my god.
There is one particular type of incident where this knowledge is of paramount importance.
Calling about a fire?
If heavy smoke in the area.
I believe it's going to be a residential fire. Be advised, we have heavy flames showing. 25 treating a LaSalle firefighter injured.
Given their capacity for exponential growth, high-rise fires present one of the greatest challenges to firefighters today, due to limited access from outside by ladders and the ease with which occupants and rescuers can become trapped. Fires in these structures pose a profound threat to life and property. High-rise buildings are, of course, designed with these considerations in mind. They are therefore built to contain fire, protect exit routes and employ architectural fire protection measures to prevent structural fire damage. National Fire Service operational procedures provide clear guidance in dealing with these situations and aim to maximise the effectiveness of firefighting and rescue operations whilst minimising risk. In agreement with these specific architectural fire-resistant qualities, firefighting procedures recommend the deployment of personnel into the building. Teams advance up towards the fire, deep into the building if necessary. A control point called a bridgehead is established 2 floors below the fire so that operations can be controlled from an advanced point. This allows the setup of entry control points so firefighters going to fight fires and carry out rescues can be recorded and, crucially, have their breathing apparatus checked so it's clear how much time they can spend in a dangerous, smoke-filled area. The amount of time each firefighter can spend fighting the fire is limited by the amount of air available, so any minute spent climbing up into a building with equipment is precious firefighting time wasted. Firefighters enter these situations confidently for good reasons. In history, there have been many instances where high-rise fires have been very advanced and aggressive and, in agreement with what the building designers specify, the structures stayed true and intact. According to a 2011 US National Fire Protection Association report, there are on average 110 high-rise fires per year in the US alone. Between 2005 and 2009, there were 550 high-rise fires. Some of the most notable in history include the Joelma building, Sao Paulo, Brazil, 1974. Sparked by an electrical fire, this residential building burned for several hours. The underlying structure was not weakened, in fact it's still in use today. The MGM Grand, which is now Bally's in Las Vegas, caught fire in 1980, killing 85 people. It's had a few facelifts and ownership changes, but the structure underneath was never compromised. It's still in use today. Los Angeles, 1988, what was then called the First Interstate Bank building burned for 3.5 hours. No structural failure at all. In fact, an insurance company moved in and today it's known as the Aon Center. In 2004, the Parque Central, Caracas, Venezuela, the country's tallest building burned for 17 hours. The facade was repaired and it is still in use today. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, One Meridian Plaza, 1991, burned for 18 hours, it was refurbished. Beijing, China, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel burned for 6 hours in 2009, it stood. Chechnya's tallest building burned for 7 hours in April 2013, it stood. Dubai, Moscow, Zurich and many others showed the same results. This is why firefighters continue to commit into these buildings to deal with fires, like those seen in September 2001 in New York and recently at Grenfell Towers in London. The firefighters in New York had absolutely no reason to suspect that those buildings could catastrophically fail due to fires. They knew there was a danger, but absolutely not from complete and sudden building failure. Firefighters are not mindless fools. They too have families to go home to and provide for. They will take calculated risks when people's lives are at risk, and there is a strong likelihood of saving lives, without a doubt. But they will not take suicidal risks. Before looking into one particular high-rise fire, which is not commonly known about, and even less well understood, we need to digress slightly and establish an honest foundation and starting point. At 5:21 PM on September the 11th, 2001, this steel-framed high-rise collapsed at freefall. It dropped like a rock due to normal office fires, according to the government's final report.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
I turned in time to see what looked like a skyscraper implosion. It looked like it had been done by a demolition crew. The whole thing just collapsing down on itself.
It was almost as if it were a planned implosion. It just pancaked.
This sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. It looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out. About a second later, the bottom floor caves out. The building followed after that.
For a large building 100 metres side to side to fall with a level roofline at freefall, straight down through its own structure, the entire building's structural integrity must have been removed simultaneously and instantaneously. Even a small amount of resistance would have been measurable as reduced downward acceleration. Any lack of symmetry in the resistance would have caused the building to tumble instead of coming straight down through its own structure. Any breaking, bending, crushing or pulverizing of the building's components would create resistance and in turn prevent all the gravitational potential energy of the building from being converted completely into kinetic energy, and therefore in turn inhibit the freefall.
This is high school physics.
A building cannot do free fall with 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system.
This is rather incredible. You cannot have a building falling at free fall, which means not one of those columns gave any resistance.
The building we are discussing is of course the Solomon Brothers building in downtown Manhattan, also known as World Trade Center 7 or just Building 7. Constructed in 1987, it was a modern steel-framed high-rise. It was a 47-storey, Class A, fully fire-protected structure with reinforced concrete floors, built around 82 solid steel structural columns rooted into the Manhattan bedrock. 58 perimeter and 24 core columns, it stood an impressive 610 feet tall. As a highly fire-protected structure, it had 3-hour fire resistance ratings for all the columns and 2-hour fire resistance ratings for the floor assemblies. Here, for contrast, you can see a construction worker walking next to one of the huge columns. The design was so robust that prospective tenants were offered the option of removing entire floors to create high bays, which was done higher up in the building.
But we really couldn't see a lot of damage from this angle, from the north side of the structures. That's why everybody was so surprised when all of a sudden it just fell.
This building's destruction was investigated by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. The simple observation of freefall should have been the starting point for their investigation. They recognised the huge implications of what freefall indicated.
A free fall time would be an object that has no structural components below it.
But they refused to acknowledge it in their investigation until they were backed into a corner by a high school physics teacher named David Chandler.
A student took a video of me dropping a soccer ball from a ladder. I imported the video into Tracker, then marked the position of the ball in each frame. Tracker captures the position and time data from which it can compute velocity and acceleration and graph anything versus anything else, basically. This is a graph of velocity versus time for that soccer ball as it's dropped. And notice that the slope, that this basically is a linear graph when you take velocity versus time when there's a constant acceleration. So as note here, the slope is nearly constant at about 9.8 meters per second squared. Notice how in the end it deviates from a straight line, because as the speed builds up, the drag increases, and so you're actually getting a little bit of a noticeable effect due to air resistance, even just from a ball dropping a few meters like that, okay? So air resistance, as subtle a force as it is detectable. This is a graph for the roofline of WTC 7. Note that for well over 2 seconds, the graph is linear, so the acceleration, similar to the soccer ball, the acceleration is constant. The slope of the linear portion of the graph is essentially equal to the acceleration of gravity within the margin of error of the measurements. In other words, for this building, even though it is falling straight down through its own supporting structure, free fall actually happened. Notice also that there's a sharp onset of free fall. The building is holding steady, then it simply lets go. In the approximately 2.5 seconds of free fall, it falls over 100 feet, the equivalent of about 8 stories. Free fall is motion under the influence of gravity alone. All resistance must be removed. Some people argue that the resistance in the case of WTC 7 was not significant because the falling mass was so great. It's true the falling mass was great, but the strength of the supporting structure was even greater. The structure was built to support 3 to 5 times the actual load. When it does eventually engage the structure, the rate of acceleration slows, then actually decelerates. Amazingly, someone at NIST added a nice straight red regression line through their stage 2 data. They even gave the equation of the line. It shows that the slope is exactly equal to the acceleration of gravity. So that red line is a flat-out absolute admission of they're even closer to the acceleration of gravity than my measurement. They were right smack on the money. They're on that number for this accepted as acceleration of gravity in feet units, okay, 32. The red line on this graph means that NIST acknowledges WT7 came down without resistance and without doing any work for over 100 feet. It means all support for 8 stories was suddenly removed by something other than the falling mass.
My name is Peter Michael Ketchum. I was born and raised in Wisconsin. I've spent much of my life in the high performance and scientific computing world. I worked at NIST for 14 years. Starting in 1997, I initially joined the High Performance Systems and Services Division, and a few years later was moved into the Mathematical and Computational Sciences Division. NIST's role, as I understand it, was to investigate the collapses of the 3 World Trade Center towers, and by that I mean towers 1, 2, and 7, and determine why they had collapsed. I didn't do anything for about a month. I think I just let it sink in. But in the middle of August, I felt very compelled to start investigating. And in a very short amount of time, it became clear to me that NIST's investigation of the collapse of the World Trade Centers was not a sincere and genuine study. And I quickly became furious. First, I was furious with myself. I couldn't believe that I had not noticed this before. How could I have not noticed this for the last 15 years? What is special about Building 7, and I think why it has gotten as much attention as it has, is because it wasn't hit by a plane. So that cannot be used as a reason for why the building collapsed. Now, it did have some fires. They weren't terribly notable fires. They were rather modest, in my opinion. And to complicate matters even more, there was an obvious foreknowledge on the part of some people that seemed to know that this building was going to come down.
That building right there, the brown building, the tall one, is number 7 World Trade Center. I've heard several reports from several different officers now that that is the building that is going to go down next. In fact, one officer told me they're just waiting for that to come down at this point.
The building is about to blow up. Moving back.
Rescue workers pushed people away from the scene.
We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up.
Now, all these stories are not compatible. You cannot have a heavily built steel frame high-rise collapse due to modest fires. If that were the case, it would be extremely unusual for that to happen. So unusual that you could not possibly predict when or if it was going to happen. At the same time, you have people more or less waiting for it to come down, and in some cases, they had reported it had collapsed before it actually did.
We are getting information now that one of the other buildings, Building 7 in the World Trade Center complex, is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing.
We've got some news just coming in, actually, that the Salomon Brothers building in New York, right in the heart of Manhattan, has also collapsed. There were very few people in the Salomon building when it collapsed. I mean, there were, I suppose, fears of possible further collapses around the area.
That's what you would hope, because this whole downtown area behind me has been completely sealed off and evacuated, apart from the emergency workers. That was done by the mayor, Rudy Giuliani.
The point is, that building is heavily built. There would be no reason to expect it to come down.
Can you confirm it was number 7 that just went in?
Yes, sir.
And you guys knew this was coming all day?
We had heard reports that the building was unstable and that it eventually would either come down on its own or it would be taken down.
As scientists, the staff at NIST will be more than well aware of the scientific investigation principle of Occam's razor, a principle of economy. It encourages the inquirer to avoid overcomplicating an investigation, to look for the most logical answer to a problem based upon accepted and tested laws of nature and science. In other words, a simple hypothesis is generally better than a complex one. Hypotheses should not be multiplied without necessity, and in other words, the simplest explanation is always to be preferred, unless further evidence forces its abandonment. An honest investigation should always start by looking at the observed event or data, then follow the evidence wherever it leads. So why did NIST, ignoring the scientifically accepted principle of Occam's razor and the obvious observation of the building's freefall, begin their investigation with such a complex and unprecedented hypothesis involving fire? Their proposal read, the challenge was to determine if a fire-induced floor system failure could occur in WTC 7 under an ordinary building contents fire.
NIST put forward a model for the collapse of Building 7 that appears to me that they were grabbing at straws.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
Now, when I was a kid, and many people today are probably too young for this, but there was a cartoonist called Rube Goldberg. He drew cartoons of these machines that did a very simple thing in an incredibly complex way, and it was meant to be humorous.
How does this door opener upper really work? You see, waiter places cat B on pile of dirty dishes A. Now cat B sees mouse C. Of course, this is a stuffed mouse because he must be used for the next waiter.
It was meant to spoof the aspect of human nature that sometimes makes things far more complicated than they need to be. And these were called Rube Goldberg machines, or Rube Goldberg devices.
And sets off bomb G, opening door H very gently.
The explanation that is given by NIST for the collapse of Building 7 sounds like a Rube Goldberg device.
You could have beams that are here that are restrained from expanding, prevented from expanding because of this column here, for example, and that can buckle. And you see an example of a buckled beam right here.
One column slides off of its seat on a few particular floors, and within a matter of moments, there is some chain reaction, like a set of dominoes, that brings the building entirely down.
It is possible that you could have a local failure as a result of a connection failing. But the likelihood of that failure dragging the entire building in such a fashion that all the columns would fail at the same time is an impossibility.
Impossibility?
Yes.
And you can see on the screen, the column at the very right is column 79. And that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining columns.
Steel frame buildings don't do that. That doesn't happen.
Here's our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event.
Does the model that NIST produced for World Trade 7 match what we actually saw? No.
The complex and expensive NIST computerized theory and animated model of collapse clearly conflicts with the observed reality. It ended very prematurely in the collapse sequence. It does not explain or reflect the building's freefall, and, as Richard Feynman explains, it does not matter what your name is, how many titles you possess, or how much money you spend. If your theory disagrees with the observed event, it's wrong.
Now I'm going to discuss how we would look for a new law. In general, we look for a new law by the following process. First, we guess it. Then we well, don't laugh, that's really true. Then we compute the consequences of the guess to see what, if this is right, if this law that we guessed is right, we see what it would imply, and then we compare those computation results to nature, or we say compare to experiment or experience, compare it directly with observation to see if it works. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. And that simple statement is the key to science. It doesn't make a difference how beautiful your guess is, it doesn't make a difference how smart you are who made the guess, or what his name is. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. That's all there is to it.
Even to this day, NIST refuses to release its data for scientific peer review. Their guardedness may be related to the fact that an organisation backed by thousands of architects and engineers has clearly identified that rather than following the evidence and data in the manner of true science, in addition to ignoring the importance of freefall, NIST has distorted and omitted many technical factors which completely undermine their theory. Distortions which include temperature simulations and fire durations, the degree of thermal expansion of the beams blamed for the collapse initiation, correct dimensions of a critical girder seat width, omissions such as the presence of girder web stiffeners and lateral support beams, girder side plates which would preclude the key lateral displacement at the alleged failing column 79, and the existence of thousands of shear studs fixing beams to floor assemblies. NIST cited the existence of shear studs in other buildings involved in more aggressive fires as the reason for their resilience. In 2008, their report stated that had the shear studs been included in the construction, the structural failure would not have occurred.
NIST went on to say in that report in 2008 was that the reason that column was able to be pushed off of its seating was because they said the column was unrestrained. And yet it was discovered last year in 2012, after a Freedom of Information Act request was granted, that that NIST claim was not true. The columns were restrained. In fact, there were 3,896 shear studs holding those columns in place.
My name is Leroy Halsey. I'm a forensic engineer and a professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks.
Steel is a very fire-resistant material.
When a structure fails, my job is to figure out why. Over the next year, with a team of PhD students, I will be rebuilding World Trade Center Building 7.
How does floor 13 respond with respect to 12?
Using the same drawings that were used to build it originally, we will reconstruct it virtually. Our goal is to figure out why it collapsed late in the afternoon on September 11, 2001, even though it was not hit by an airplane. The investigation conducted by the National Institute of Standards and Technology concluded
what we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fires.
Our investigation will evaluate the probability that this was the cause of the collapse. We are making this study open and transparent. Whether you are a physicist, engineer, architect, fire expert, or specialist in another field, or just an ordinary citizen, we want your participation. We are making all of our data available online. Every aspect of our process regarding the modeling will be shared. And we will be giving regular updates from the lab as we continue our work. Join us in getting to the bottom of why World Trade Center 7 collapsed on September 11th, 2001.
Towards the end of their 2-year study, in late 2016, Professor Halsey's team released their preliminary findings. The following sums up their conclusions.
Did Building 7 collapse from fires? And the answer is no. UAF finding shows that the girder bearing at column 79 moved less than 2 inches. It would not have been a problem. It did not have a problem in lateral buckling, not using their fires.
What does that mean? I can't tell you how important what you just heard is. Now, you may not have understood all of it, but what it means is that this is a direct challenge to the computer analysis that NIST did to prove their collapse by fire theory. They juggled this football for 7 years, hoping everybody would forget about it and go home and not talk about it anymore, because here is the worst example of a deception of all of 9/11, because it's so clear. This building, as you'll see in the evidentiary hearings tomorrow, dropped like a rock straight down uniformly, symmetrically into its own footprint in under 7 seconds at free fall acceleration. Dr. Halsey just proved that that cannot happen by fire. That means all of academic institutions across this country and around the world have been lied to.
If you could, on a scale of 1 to 100, what do you think the possibility is of this particular building failing with the data with regard to these specific fires? On a scale of 1 to 100, how probable do you think it is, or how possible do you think it is that this building could have collapsed simply because of the fires?
0. So my answer to you today is that the fire did not bring this building down.
Thank you, everybody, for coming, and we really appreciate the courage you have to show up and the openness you have to listen to what we have to say tonight. And I'm just going to start by telling a little bit about my story and how I came to change my views on this completely. When anyone would talk about it, I couldn't listen. I just didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to consider it. And my lieutenant for years had told me that it looked like, something didn't add up. And I just told him he was crazy. He should leave the country. I'm very patriotic, and I just thought, if you believe that anyone could be responsible for this, you shouldn't be here. It was a friend of mine from the military that actually opened my eyes to something else. And one thing led to another, and I kept looking. 9/11 kept coming up. And because it wasn't being shoved down my throat, I decided to look into it a little bit more. And when I did, I knew there was a lot of conspiracy theories out there and a lot of crazy conspiracy theories, and I decided to do my own research. And so I went to the Zacharias Moussaoui exhibit trials. This is the U.S. government's evidence on 9/11, basically. And I wanted to see what they had. I was kind of shocked. I wanted to know, how did they identify the terrorists so quickly? How were they so sure? And so as I started looking, this is what I found, and this is the main evidence that they had. This was found after the plane crash. This was found the next day. So you can see they found bandanas, papers, more passports. You can see these passports. They're pretty well intact. I've been to a lot of fires, and if they're out in a room that's not on fire, we'll find this kind of stuff. But the thing that stuck out to me, and someone else had pointed out, was, well, wait a second. Those passports, those IDs, they were inside either pockets or luggage or inside that plane. Then that plane hit those towers or went into the field or went into the Pentagon, and then they blew up. There were big fireballs we all saw, and then they were found actually on top of the pile. So that stuff started not adding up for me. I was like, well, wait a second, how'd they find it the next day? It should have been either on the ground or burned up or buried in the rubble. That led to Colonel Nelson. Once I started looking into this, I read his article, and he's a 34-year Air Force crash investigator, and he'd written a pretty amazing article, and he talks about his own experience into 9/11. And once I spoke with him, I asked him, I said, when did you first notice something was wrong? He said, for me, it was the first day. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, what stuck out to you? And he said, well, I've been to a lot of crash sites. I know how they work. And he said, it was the Pentagon. And he said, when I looked at the Pentagon, and here's some pictures of it, he said, what I saw the first day was people picking up debris, and they were removing it as quickly as possible. He said, every crash I've ever been to, it's the MP's job to secure that area, flag it, tag it, take pictures. Nobody touches anything until after the investigators are there. Well, they were cleaning it up before any investigation. He said by day 3, he knew something was wrong. So that really made me start thinking more. And the more I looked into it, the 9/11 Commission themselves, I found out, they doubt their own investigation. And so many people in America believe the 9/11 Commission. That's the people who believe the official story, they still swear by it. Well, I found out the investigators themselves don't.
So there are all kinds of reasons. We thought we were set up to fail. We got started late. We had a very short time frame. Indeed, we had to get it extended. We did not have enough money. They were afraid we were going to hang somebody, that we would point the finger.
Lee and I write in our book that we think the commission in many ways was set up to fail because we had not enough money. We didn't have enough time. We'd been appointed by the most partisan people in Washington.
9/11 was the greatest loss of life and property damage in U.S. fire history. This should have been the most protected, preserved, over-tested, and thorough investigation of a crime scene in world history. Sadly, it was not. What was it? Well, we know from their own admission, the majority of the evidence was destroyed. Like Richard said, 22 years of experience. I've seen a lot of crime scenes. I've never seen anything like this in my life. I was out at the site. I saw trucks leaving faster than anywhere I've ever seen, but I accepted it at the time, and for years I accepted it because it was a recovery and rescue operation, and that's normal to have something like that going. Again, we never seen anything like it, but that was expected. What I didn't know for years, what was going on behind the scenes, was that evidence was being destroyed when it was shipped off.
On the day of 9/11, while the remains of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center 7 were still smoldering, one of Mayor Giuliani's first concerns was clearing away the evidence from the crime scene.
We were able to move 120 dump trucks out of the city last night, which will give you a sense of the work that was done overnight.
It's wild out here. They just keep coming. Look. It doesn't stop. There's more. I keep thinking it's at the end, and it's not.
Despite reassurances that the rapid removal of the evidence from Ground Zero was important for emergency access, this process went far beyond merely clearing a path for rescue workers. As Eric Lawyer, founder of Firefighters for 9/11 Truth, points out, the massive operation to haul away over 1.5 million tons of debris and to sell much of the steel to Chinese firm Baosteel at discount prices was not just an overzealous approach to clearing the area, but was itself a crime.
By their own admission, Tower 7 investigation, this investigation of Tower 7 had no physical evidence. How do you investigate a crime when you've destroyed all the evidence? It doesn't make sense. They also admit that they refused to test the explosives or to test for explosives or residue of thermite. Now, this is what I'm going to go into here just real quickly, is there are national standards for an investigation. That's what all of us are asking for, an investigation that follows national standards and holds people accountable. This manual right here, just so you can see it, is what we'd call the kind of the Fire Investigation 101. This is the most basic fire investigation manual there. This is for the 2001 edition. This is what should have been referred to, at least. It doesn't have to be followed exactly, but it should have been used as a guideline for the investigation. I'm just going to cover a few of the things that are in here. So NIST violated, and the initial investigators that did not protect the scene violated the most basic of the guidelines. And I'm going to cover 5 of them here. One is the NFPA 9.3.6. It covers spoliation of evidence. Specifically what it reads is once evidence has been removed from the scene, it should be maintained and not destroyed or altered until the investigation is complete. The steel was melted down prior to the investigation. We know that from their own admission. This is no conspiracy theory stuff. 19.2.4, exotic accelerants. If on the scene you find melted steel or concrete, you should consider the use of exotic accelerants. And they specifically say in the manual, thermite mixtures produce exceedingly hot fires that can account for melted steel and concrete. That also says they leave residues that can be tested for visually and chemically identifiable.
FEMA describes samples of steel that had been thinned to razor sharpness. In some cases, there were inexplicable holes in the steel. The fire engineering professors who found the samples could not come up with an explanation for it. They also could not explain the sulfidation of the steel. That is, steel had been chemically changed at the microstructural level in ways that indicated a chemical eutectic mixture had been achieved between sulfur, iron, and oxygen, causing steel to melt.
Again, they did not test for it. And just put it in perspective, on a routine house fire, if we suspect even the slightest use of an accelerant, we're going to test for it when there's no fatalities, when there's very little property damage. So to not do it on this, there is absolutely no excuse. I can't drive that point home enough. 18.15 is analyze fuel source. All available fuel sources should be considered and eliminated until one fuel can be identified as meeting all the physical damage criteria. For example, if you find pulverized concrete, which we all know there was in all 3 buildings, there was pulverized concrete, the only fuels that can create seeded explosions should be considered. So they shouldn't be considering fires. They shouldn't be doing that. It doesn't account for pulverized concrete. They should only be considering exotic accelerants and explosives. 19.4.8.2.6, extremism. The terrorist may include fire as but one of a variety of weapons along with explosives used in furthering his or her goal. We know they used them in '93. Why would we not test for them now? There was reports that day, multiple reports, which I'll get into here in a second. So they could have put them in the basement. How do we know that unless we test for it? I mean, even if it is the terrorists that they claim they are, we need to test this.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7. We ran down detailed computer simulations of blast scenarios. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses.
You want to call your mother or something? You gotta get back from here. You know that, you gotta get back. All right, I know.
Keep your eye on that building as they coming down.
We made it at least 2 blocks, and we started running, floor by floor, instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
if they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
14.3, preservation of the fire scene and physical evidence. We find the following. The cause of a fire explosion is not known until near the end of the investigation. The entire fire scene should be considered physical evidence and should be protected and preserved. It's just over and over. There's so many. You can go to our website, the Firefighters for 9/11 Truth. We have many more of these actual chapters that cover what they should have done that they did not do. So now, by their own admission, in all 3 building collapses, NIST refused to physically test, like Dr. Stephen Jones did, for explosives. This is just unbelievable. And here are their excuses, and I quote, "It is unlikely that 100 pounds of thermite or more could have been carried into World Trade Center 7 and placed around columns without being detected, either prior to September 11th or during that day." So again, I've been on a lot of fire scenes, and I've seen a lot of investigations, and why would we not test because something's hard to do? That's the exact reason you need to investigate it. If that was hard to do, we need to find out how they did it. And number two, NIST excuse. In addition, no blast sounds were heard on the audio tracks of the video recordings during the collapse of World Trade Center 7 or reported by witnesses. That's one of the excuses why they didn't test. Well, apparently they didn't read Chapter 18. 18 is the general definition of explosions. Although an explosion is almost always accompanied by the production of a loud noise, the noise itself is not, in big bold letters, an essential element in the definition of an explosion. The generation and violent escape of gases are the primary criteria of an explosion. So that alone says they should have tested for it. But then we also, NIST has lied, and we can prove it. As soon as the new investigation happens, the evidence is out there for you to see right now. We have 118 first responders who reported explosions. We have the radio transmissions from FDNY members that are still recorded today that reported explosions. We have audio recordings. We have video recordings. I've personally talked to witnesses that heard them. So there's nothing short of saying they lied, and they need to be held accountable. And besides that, like I said, there is no excuse for not testing for explosives. And so at the very least, at the very best, even if you want to believe the official story, this was the most incompetent investigation of all time. And I've talked to a lot of investigators that were there, and I asked them the specific question, why did they refuse to test? They weren't the ones who refused, but NIST did. And they said, all we can say, all they can answer is incompetence, or they tell me to shut up. They cannot give me any reason that follows national standards. So, but the reality, after all the research everybody here and the incredible people we're in the room with today have done, the reality is it was a criminal investigation to cover up the crime. So, I'd like, just to finish, I'd like to read a quote. This is from a retired, decorated FDNY lieutenant. Anyone who knows the fire service, he is a stud. He worked on Ladder Company 26, Rescue Company 3, Rescue Company 1 in his career. Anyone who knows, those are amazing companies. Here's his comment. Trade Tower 7 by itself is the smoking gun. Not hit by an aircraft with only a few relatively small fires, it came down in a classic crimp and implosion, something only very precise demolitions can accomplish, which takes days, if not weeks, to prepare. The 9/11 Commission didn't even mention it, and FEMA actually stated they didn't know why it collapsed and left it at that. Brothers, I know that the above implications are hard, almost unthinkable, but the official explanation is utter nonsense, and 343 of our murdered brothers are crying out for justice. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Needless to say, an investigation of the 9/11 crime scene following the National Investigation Standards has never been conducted and never will be, as Giuliani oversaw the illegal destruction of the evidence itself. In the late 1990s, the mayor oversaw the creation of a state-of-the-art $13 million emergency command center to coordinate the city's disaster recovery and response efforts. Located on the 23rd floor of World Trade Center Building 7, just across Vesey Street from the Twin Towers, the center, dubbed by local press at the time as Giuliani's bunker, included reinforced, bulletproof, and bomb-resistant walls, its own air supply and water tank, beds, showers to accommodate 30 people, and 3 backup generators. It could be used to monitor all of New York's emergency communications frequencies and was staffed 24 hours a day. And yet, remarkably, on the morning of 9/11, neither Mayor Giuliani nor any other city personnel or police or fire department officials were in the bunker after the Twin Tower strikes. So why wasn't the mayor and the city's emergency personnel in the location that had been purpose-built for just such an event? According to Giuliani, they had been told to evacuate because they had been given a warning that the Twin Towers were going to collapse. A warning that was evidently not passed on to any of the emergency personnel that were still working in the buildings.
I went down to the scene and we set up headquarters at 75 Barclay Street, which was right there with the police commissioner, the fire commissioner, the head of emergency management, and we were operating out of there when we were told that the World Trade Center was going to collapse. And it did collapse before we could actually get out of the building. So we were trapped in the building for 10, 15 minutes and finally found an exit and got out, walked north, and took a lot of people with us.
Giuliani, in his own words, has admitted that he was warned that the World Trade Center was going to collapse. This despite the fact that there was no possible way for this to be predicted in the first hour of the unfolding disaster. Even more incredibly, despite being given this warning, no effort was made to pass it on to the police, firefighters, and other responders who were still working in and around the buildings. It is no wonder, then, that the fire department of New York so passionately detests Giuliani for his actions in disgracing their fallen brothers and covering up the 9/11 crime.
Rudy Giuliani has used the horrible events of September 11, 2001, to create a carefully crafted persona. But the fact is, what Rudy portrays is not a full picture of the decisions made that led, in our view, to the unnecessary deaths of our FDNY members and the attempt to stop the dignified recovery of those lost.
I'm Leanne McAdoo with Infowars.com, reporting here from Times Square. I am standing next to Rudy Dent. He's a 32-year veteran of the New York City Fire Department. He's worked as well with the New York City Police Department. And you retired right after 9/11. He was there on 9/11. He saw World Trade Center Tower 7 come down. Rudy, tell us about what happened that day.
Well, I was off that day, and I received a call at home, and I got to see both buildings come down on TV. I jumped on my motorcycle. I did about 120 miles an hour across the Tappan Zee. I reported to my firehouse, and then I got my gear. A bunch of us got together. We commandeered a mail truck, and we made our way down to the site. At that time, Building 7 was still up. I saw Building 7 come down. My fellow firefighters who were there, they did that involuntary jerk when a loud explosion goes off. You know, you can't help it, and they did. I'm a Vietnam veteran too, so I kind of didn't jump like they did, but there was an explosion. The building did come down in complete classical controlled demolition. It came down on its own footprint. There's no question.
And then talk to me a little bit, obviously, as a professional in the fire department for 30 plus years, they're saying that blaming it on office fires, just a few office fires.
Well, if it wasn't so serious a situation, that would be completely laughable. That is ridiculous. First of all, our guys were up there. They were calling for additional hand lines to mop up the isolated pockets of fire. And let me just explain one thing. Never in the history of the world, never in the history of high-rise skyscrapers has ever a skyscraper ever come down because of fire. And I'm talking massive fire. And you know the reason why? Because fire does not burn by itself hot enough to compromise and melt steel.
You see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry.
Yeah,
like lava.
What we had in the World Trade Center, and I saw myself, was molten lava-like pockets of molten steel. All right, I spent the night on the pile searching for bodies, and I saw that with my own eyes. So who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe a bunch of government bureaucrats or my fellow brothers, which I lost 343 guys that day? And I lost Tommy O'Hagan, Bruce Van Hines, and Kenny Kumpel. And I can never forget that. I think of that before I go to bed. I think about it the first thing in the morning when I wake up. And it's in honor of them and their family that I will continue to do everything I can to make the rest of the world wake up to the fact that this was a false flag operation.
Right.
They call you a conspiracy theorist, and instead of talking about the technical, they want to know the who, the whys, and the whats. In other words, they want to engage in the conspiracy theory. World Trade Center 7, I have no idea how they could do something like that, but it's obvious through the evidence we have that it was brought down in controlled demolition. So that is a job for policemen and investigators. That's their job, and they are failing at this point to accomplish that.
There was an explosion, and the landing gave way. And I was left there hanging. I had to climb back up, and now I had to walk back up to the 8th floor.
That's right. I'm standing here right now just off Broadway by City Hall with Michael Hess, who is the city's corporation counsel. Mr. Hess, you were trapped in, I believe, 7 World Trade Center. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, I was. I was up in the emergency management center on the 23rd floor, and when all the power went out in the building, another gentleman and I walked down to the 8th floor where there was an explosion, and we've been trapped on the 8th floor with smoke, thick smoke all around us for about an hour and a half. But the New York Fire Department, as terrific as they are, just came and got us out.
Zie je vanaf boven gaan? Nee, je gaat vanaf onder.
Die gaat vanaf onder, ja.
Toch?
Ja.
Ze hebben gewoon kolommen weggeblazen. Er is nagesprongen.
Dit valt anders dan het World Trade Center.
Vind je niet dan?
Ja, je ziet het, de onderste verdiepingen gaan eerst.
Ja, en de rest zakt er gewoon in. Dus dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten?
Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Maar dit is ook op 11 september gebeurd.
Dezelfde dag?
Dezelfde dag.
Dezelfde dag? Weet je dat zeker?
Ja.
Was het zeker weten de 11e? Dat kan geen waar zijn.
7 uur nadat de World Trade Center naar beneden viel.
Ja?
The implications of Building 7 coming down in free fall are huge for every fire service in the world. The reason for that is because when you fight a high-rise building fire, what you do is you go to the floor below the fire, you establish a bridgehead, you then send breathing apparatus teams up the stairs onto the next floor where the fire actually is, together with water jets, to go and find the fire, locate it, attack it, and put it out. You do not, at any time, think that the building you're actually stood in is suddenly going to collapse down into a pile of rubble in 6 seconds the way that Building 7 did. It's the only steel-framed building in history, high-rise building in history, that's ever collapsed from fire alone. All of the others have stayed up. Where there's been fires, there's been partial collapses, there's been little bits fall off, but the entire building has never gone from 47 stories to 3 stories of rubble in a few seconds.
I joined the fire service in November 2000 and I'm currently employed by the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service in Edinburgh. I've been aware of the problems with the official story for 9/11 since approximately it was 2010. For a period of time I was in a state of shock that we had not been told the truth about that event. I was surprised that I hadn't seen Building 7 before. It's not something that's been publicised. There are not many people that know about it. If you want to know about Building 7, you more or less have to go on the internet and research it for yourself.
There's no question that that was a demolition job that anybody with an open mind and common sense cannot deny. The fire department mentality is such that it's patriotic. It's pro government. It's pro normalcy, and especially when we were doing the funerals. I did 7 and I couldn't do any more. When people have died and they don't want to hear that. That's the last thing. And especially unpatriotic. That's not something you talk about. So no, I didn't even bring it up. But they're just not ready for it. If you're really patriotic and you really care about what happened to our brothers and what is happening to our country, start doing your own research. We have a web where you can start to research and cross-reference things, and there are materials that you can read, and there are sources you can go to, and you can put together your own incontrovertible facts that point you in the right direction. And don't rely on the media. The media is not there for you. It's there to manipulate you.
We could prove that your story is false. And I don't use the word prove lightly. But when you have people coming up with a story that violates the laws of physics, not just once, but repeatedly, you can say, okay, that story's wrong, and what we have to do now is hope that the people of the world have at least enough grasp of science to see what we want to explain, to understand what we want to explain here.
Conspiracy theory is a way of trying to discredit inquiry. I mean, it's perfectly legitimate to say, here is a very, very serious event that occurred. It killed thousands of people right off the bat. It's killing firefighters still today. It's used to justify war. It's killed thousands of American soldiers. It's killed millions of Iraqis and Afghanis. It's literally in the millions. And to consider that investigating the roots of that is somehow not legitimate, or that you have to be somehow psychologically impaired, some sort of conspiratorial thinking. They're trying to psychologize all this to where people can dismiss people who even ask these questions. I think it's being a responsible citizen to ask questions of your government and to not just take what they say without any kind of critical thought.
There's just so many anomalies, so many things that are absolutely dead wrong that are still being promoted today as a myth to the general public. And the general public, in my opinion, is buying it. They're probably just like I was. Before I look into the details, well, sure, why wouldn't you buy it? But the devil's in the details. That's where you have to look, and that's where this whole thing just comes apart at the seams.
The truth is, conspiracies do sometimes occur. The first hijack occurred latest about 8:20 a.m. For the next hour and 40 minutes, no aircraft was put into the air, even though there was at the U.S. Andrews Air Force Base, 10 miles from Washington, D.C., a flight of F-16, a whole squadron of top-level fighters. No planes were flown in from other air bases, even though at top speed they were certainly within range. Why did that happen? We know that where an aircraft goes on course, it is a legal requirement that aircraft are put into the air to check on the position and purpose of commercial aircraft. Why on this single day did it not happen? In the previous 9 months it had happened 67 times. It was a routine procedure. Why did this not happen on that very important day? That question has never been answered. It was a 580-page avoidance of any serious explanation. All that I can say is, let other people make their judgments about 9/11. If they think that the war on terrorism explains it, I would like to know why all the facts about the failure to respond before, at and after can be explained. When you look at that evidence, it is so compelling, so comprehensive, that it is very difficult in my view to come to a different conclusion from the one that I do. They are facts. They're uncomfortable facts. They're shocking facts. Deeply, deeply shocking. But you have to face up to them because they have actually happened. And they demand an explanation which is the most cogent, the most compelling, the most plausible to fit those facts. We do need to know the truth. We do need to know the truth.
Later on, as I researched and integrated more of the information, I also had to come to terms with the very uncomfortable feeling of being a dupe, of being a sucker, of believing what the government told me without checking it out for myself first. I consider myself to be a well-educated, mature adult, and to realize that I had just absorbed the government story lock, stock, and barrel without really questioning it was very humbling. It was not fun. It really made me question my own intelligence and my own integrity. One thing I know as a person with a degree in psychology is that psychological terms can be used to hurt people as well as to help people. And we can marginalize people. We can say that they're nuts if they believe something that the majority of us do not believe. This has been happening with people who've been learning about 9/11 and are trying to do something about it. 9/11 is a very difficult subject for people to look at. It's full of tragedy, it's very grim, it's very sad in every conceivable way, and the consequences of 9/11 have been very tragic for many, many people.
I believe in human curiosity and human intelligence, and there's a limit to how long people can go on thinking that one bullet inflicted 7 wounds on 2 different people in the presidential car in Dallas in 1963. That sort of thing slowly becomes ridiculous because of what's being called paradigm shift. It's not that you persuade the older generation die. And then you have a new generation whose minds have not been distorted by the propaganda campaigns. The mainstream media are, in a sense, digging their grave by adhering to a position on conspiracy theories which they could get away with back in the days of the Kennedy assassination because they monopolized American access to information. They don't have that monopoly anymore, and they're losing to the internet. And one of the reasons that people are going to the internet and not to the mainstream media, if anyone is curious about 9/11, they know they have to go to the internet. So in a sense, I think that technology has become a great ally for those of us who want the truth.
This is a big issue. I mean, it's not just the 9/11, it's not just the buildings or the science or the physics, but it opens up into a very, very huge issue out there. And no one person can tackle this issue. But it's my opinion that if you know about it, do something. Whether you're an artist, whether you're a poet, whether you're a singer, you don't have to be an engineer for sure about this. Matter of fact, most of the more brilliant people out there are not engineers. They're very, very intelligent people that know what's going on. So I like to say, not everybody can do everything, but everyone can do something. You can do your little part to help share what's really going on out there.
Eventually, I was able to realize that 9/11 presents an opportunity for us to find our sense of integrity again, to find our sense of courage, our sense of optimism, that now that we know a little bit more about how things actually work, how wars are actually created by governments, how governments get people to go to war, we have an opportunity now, a wonderful opportunity, which fills me with great joy, to do something about it, to find a way to stop this from occurring again.